Out of all the new cards in Amonkhet, by far the one with the most hype is Gideon of the Trials, and that's because of its last ability, which says as long as you control a Gideon Planeswalker, you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Now this isn't the first time we've seen a card printed that makes it so you can't lose the game, but the cards that make it so you can't lose the game tend to cost more. So you have things like Platinum Angels cost 7, you have things like Worship that cost 4, but have conditions attached to it. Whereas Gideon Trials seems like if you can protect your Gideon and Planeswalker, it seems like a done deal that you're not going to lose. And that's what people are most excited about. Now his first two abilities aren't bad either, the first one being +1 until your next turn, prevent all damage target opponent would deal. So that's useful in certain situations, like say your opponent has the Tarmogoyf that keeps attacking you, you can pin down the Tarmogoyf until you find a way to deal with it. Now its second ability is a typical Gideon ability, which allows it to become an indestructible creature until the end of the turn, and in this case it's a 4/4 creature. Now the question everyone wants to know is, does Gideon of the Trials have a place in Modern? And my answer is absolutely yes. But the question is, to what extent is that yes? Now the reason why I'm so sure we're going to see this card played, at least in sideboards, is because it stops certain decks. Decks like Mill, Infect, and Ad Nauseam are going to have a very difficult time dealing with this guy when it's out. Because if you look at Mill's so focused on just getting rid of the opponent's graveyard that they're not too concerned about dealing damage to the opponent. And so now they have to do two things. They have to mill the opponent, and they also have to make sure the Gideon is dead. And so Mill's already on the border in Modern where it's like almost unplayable. And with this card, I think it's going to push it into being unplayable. Infect's in a similar position where it's so focused on doing one thing that making it do two things is now going to stretch it really thin. Infect's already kind of in the dumps because of the Gitaxian probe ban. So like Infect, it's so focused on dealing damage to your opponent in the form of poison counters that it doesn't really have room to take this guy out as well. And Ad Nauseam's going to have a really hard time with this card because Ad Nauseam's all about finishing your opponent off quickly in one blow. Now it has to do it in two blows where it not only has to wipe your opponent's life out, but it also has to kill Gideon, and I just don't see Ad Nauseam getting around a deck that plays this card. But what about main deck? What decks in Modern will be able to main deck this Gideon? And if you look at the Modern metagame right now, not a lot of decks really have a place for it. Now, a lot of decks in Modern do run white, but usually when they run white, it's as a splash color, mainly for sideboard. So decks like Abzan Death Shadow, Abzan, Burn, Bant Eldrazi, they all use white, but they use it very sparingly. Like Abzan really only uses white for Siege Rhino, Path to Exile, and Lingering Souls. And with Gideon needing 2 white mana to cast it, fitting Gideon into one of these decks just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Now if we go down the list of most played Modern decks, we eventually get to Eldrazi and Taxes, which makes up about 1.4% of the meta currently, and it is heavy in white, so it would be able to fit Gideon into it, but the question is, what benefit would it have from putting Gideon in it? And honestly, I don't think Eldrazi and Taxes has any benefit of putting it main deck. Sideboard for sure, main deck not so much. Because if you think about it, what benefit does Eldrazi and Taxes have by having a 4/4 indestructible creature or an emblem that says you can't lose the game if you control Gideon? Because if Eldrazi and Taxes is going to win, it's probably going to win regardless of Gideon's out. And if it's going to lose, it's probably going to lose regardless of whether or not Gideon's out as well. But another Modern deck out there that makes up 1.4% of the metagame is Bluelight Control. Now this deck has a much better chance of fitting Gideon in the main deck compared to Eldrazi and Taxes. Now this deck already has a good amount of white in it, and it already uses Planeswalkers to finish the game off, so fitting Gideon into it wouldn't really change much about the deck. It'll just make it a little bit faster, it seems like. However, I don't really see Gideon revolutionizing this deck. I don't think having Gideon in it will change much about it. I think it might make it a little bit faster, but it's still going to do the same thing. It's still going to use counters to delay the game and then finish off with whatever it can, either by a land or with the Planeswalker. And Gideon helps it, but I don't think it's going to change it all that much. But there is one deck out there that will for sure benefit from this card heavily, main deck, and that I believe is White-Red Prison. Now, White-Red Prison's been flying under people's radar for a long time, and recently it's been doing pretty well in tournaments, but it still is only sitting at less than 1% of the metagame. But if you're not 100% familiar with how this deck works, now's the time to get used to it, because I think in the next few months, the way the metagame's looking, it seems like White-Red Prison's going to have a very good shot at dominating the metagame. So here's how this deck works. Ideally, it's going to play Chalice of the Void early on for 1, and that's going to slow your opponent down. Then follow up with a Blood Moon, or maybe even turn 1 Blood Moon with Simeon, and that's going to lock your opponent out further, and then that's going to make it hard for your opponent to play with whatever they're trying to do, and whatever creatures make it past that lock will be wiped out by Anger of the Gods or Wrath of God. And once your opponent's just sitting there unable to do anything, that's when you play your Planeswalkers to finish the game off. And this deck feels kind of like Blue-White Control, just with a ton more creature removal. But by far the biggest drawback to this deck is that it's very hard to go from locking your opponent out to finishing the game off, because sometimes there's just a massive amount of turns in between those two stages happening. And notice that this deck tends to run 25 lands, which is pretty absurd, because if you look at like Tron, Eldrazi Tron, that tends to run 24 lands. So this runs more lands than any deck that I can think of off the top of my head, and only 4 of those lands are actually fetch lands. So that means a lot of turns just gonna be drawing lands. And it desperately needs those lands because the casting cost for this deck is so high. Like, there's so many cards that cost more than 2 mana. In fact, there's no cards in this deck that cost 1 mana. Everything's either 2 costing, 3 costing, or 4 costing, with the old Gideon being 5 costing. So for the time being, it really needs those lands to pull off these bigger planeswalkers, but that's where the new Gideon comes in. Because if you're able to replace some of these bigger planeswalkers with a smaller planeswalker, and that effectively does the same thing, which finishes your opponent off, then you're looking pretty good and you can cut some of these lands out and make this deck a lot more playable. But other than casting cost, there's also a lot of other reasons why Gideon the Trials fits perfectly in this deck. First of all, it's a planeswalker, so when you board wipe, it's not going to die, and even if it's out as a creature, it still won't die because it's indestructible. And normally you'd still have to worry about Path to Exile, but with 4 Chalice of the Void's main deck, I don't think Path to Exile will be a problem. And the biggest reason why Gideon the Trials works perfectly in White-Red Prison has to do with the card Leyline of Sanctity, which is actually mainboarded in a lot of versions of White-Red Prison. A lot of people don't seem to realize this, but you cannot use Lightning Bolt on a Planeswalker if they have Leyline of Sanctity out, because when you bolt a Planeswalker or deal damage to a Planeswalker with a spell, you're not actually dealing damage directly to the Planeswalker, you're dealing the damage to your opponent and redirecting it to the Planeswalker. So if Leyline of Sanctity is out, your Planeswalkers are safe from burn spells, which means that if you're able to deal with your opponent's creatures, your Planeswalkers aren't going to die. So Gideon Trials puts out his emblem, can't lose the game with Gideon out, and they don't have a way of dealing with your Gideon, then it's going to extend the game pretty long, and White-Red Prison is totally fine with that, which has tons of things to do late game to finish off your opponent. And worst case scenario, even if you don't have Leyline of Sanctity out, your Gideon the Trials is still safe from Lightning Bolt on the turn that it plays, because your opponent can't respond to the Gideon entering, which means that you can use its +1 ability before your opponent Lightning Bolts it. But after all that, you're still not convinced White-Red Prison has a place in Modern. There's still more, and that has to do with the metagame right now. Currently, the deck that's everywhere is Death Shadow, and that's a deck that runs heavy 1-drops. The typical Death Shadow aggro deck has a whopping 24 1-drops. So if you're able to play Chalice of the Void turn 1 or even turn 2, their deck is almost made useless. And on top of that, they run Tarmogoyfs, and you run 3 Rest in Pieces in your sideboard. It's just like White-Red Prison is just the perfect matchup against Death Shadow. And even if you don't get your Chalices out, you still have your Leyline of Sanctities, which shuts down this deck hard, because they have 4 Inquisitions, 4 Thoughtseizes, 2 command cards, and Liliana. So because they can't target you anymore, all those cards are made just about useless. And Burn's in a similar position where they have a whopping 23 1-drops and a whopping 28 2-drops. And if you're able to do double Chalice, like Chalice for 1 and then Chalice for 2, it's like, what are they gonna do? Nothing. And if they get their creatures out, you board wipe them. If you have your Leyline of Sanctities out, they can't target you. It just wrecks these decks. And if you've ever been one of the many players that's thought, gosh, I hate Burn, it's so unfair, now's your chance to make a deck that's even more unfair. But the goodness doesn't end there, because if we look at the other most played decks in Modern right now, Dredge, this deck wrecks Dredge also because it has 3 Rest in Pieces. It also has 3 Anger of the Gods, which not only kills their creatures, but exiles them. So that deck's taken out of commission. And really, White-Red Prison has an answer to all the decks being played right now. It does struggle a little bit with Tron, but it also runs 4 Blood Moons, so it just really has an answer for every deck out there. And once Gideon the Trials comes out, it's just going to make this deck that much better, and it's going to be crazy to see how far this deck goes. If you want to see this deck in action, click the video on the left, and you can see just how much fun my opponents had playing me. And if you're hyped for the new Amonkhet set, be sure to subscribe. I have a ton of Amonkhet videos coming out about drafting and Modern, so be sure to check back for that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a great day.